I would like to introduce our speaker, David Nelson Wren, with remarks prepared by Joni Mackey, granddaughter of Ardrossan's original owners. David has worn many hats during his life. First and foremost, he is an independent scholar who focuses mainly on history and art. He was raised in Dallas and thankfully relocated to Philadelphia. For a while, he and his husband, David Blake, ran a very successful bed and breakfast in Trumansburg, New York, where I think we all need to maybe take a field trip. While there, he wrote a twice-weekly column for the Ithaca Journal. David spent 19 years researching the book on Ardrossan, and many of those years were in the archives at Ardrossan, where he found a great deal of the information needed for the book. David is now the house historian. He lives in Ardrossan with his husband. And with that, I will turn it over to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And I have a few thank yous myself. I'd like to thank Linnea West for all the work that she's done here, and Martha Morris, of course, and her committee with the Library and Archives collection. And of course, to the Arcadia Foundation for making all of this possible. On a personal note, I want to thank Phil Graham for doing a lot of restoration of the photographs and the images that you'll see, and the great tech guys in the back that are going to keep the fires out tonight. So with that, Ardrossan, the last great estate on the Philadelphia Main Line. It's called the last great estate because it indeed was, and for a long time, many, many years, the 750 acres that made up Ardrossan was the largest piece of undeveloped land near any major American city. The idea for a book came about when Robert Montgomery Scott, president of the Art Museum, invited us to come to his apartment on the 3rd floor to see the Belmont Stakes one day. And of course, you know, there's a lot of lead up to this very short race. But during that time, we talked about the idea of a book, and it was actually Walter Annenberg who encouraged Bob to pursue the idea with me. There were lots of starts and stops, and then eventually, as you probably know, Bob died. And at his memorial service, Barbara Eberline pulled me aside and said, "You must finish the book." And I said, it's a no-go because Bob had championed it. Bob had different ideas about the book than I did, and there were a lot of stops and starts, as I said, and I'm a very obsessive researcher, and Bob used to complain that I would let the facts sometimes get in the way of a good story. But Barbara that day said, no, Bob's cousin Joni Mackey will champion the book. So I met with Joni, and she said to me that you are writing about a house, and this is a home my grandparents built. So instead of just having the main house, it should include all the other houses, the dairy, the cattle herd, all of the things that made Ardrossan quite an extraordinary place. So she had discussed some variables with her cousins, I suppose, and she and her cousin Mary Reamer had saved a lot of documents. And one day I was led to the 3rd floor to a former linen room, which they considered to be their archive. There was even a little sign that said archive room. It was padlocked, and we went in, and it was a sea of banker boxes, and not filled with regular files, but just papers, stacked upon papers upon papers. From 8:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon, 5 days a week for 2 years, I touched and read every single piece of paper. And that's the story you're going to hear tonight. Ardrossan is located along the main line of Philadelphia. In case you're not familiar, it's in Villanova. This is an early railroad map of the main line. And Colonel Montgomery was always intent on building the house in Radnor. This is a photograph of him taken in the ballroom at Ardrossan about 1916. He was born in Radnor and became a self-made man. He studied banking and finance, and apprenticed with Stotesbury, and then formed his own firm, Montgomery, Clothier, and Tyler. They became quite successful, took Baldwin Locomotive public, and became a man that was destined to build Ardrossan, and also own a fabulous plantation in Georgetown, South Carolina. He married Charlotte Benny Hope Tyler. She was not originally from Philadelphia. Her family was from Providence, Rhode Island, but she moved here with her father and grandfather. They lived on 15th and Walnut Street. They were in the banking business, and she was truly the belle of the ball. Miss Tyler and the Colonel were second cousins. Now, this is a map of Ardrossan that shows just part of it, that you can see where at the top where the main house is here. And just to give you an idea, the estate took up land that encompassed, if you're familiar with the area, everything from Chanticleer all the way over to Godfrey Road, and from Newtown Road up to all the way pretty much to parts of Ithaca. Ardrossan is the ancestral home of the Montgomerys in Scotland. And it actually has a meaning. It means height of the little promontory. And if you visit, you'll see that when you drive up the drive, it's perfectly placed on its own little promontory. Now, to build the house, the Montgomerys looked at all kinds of different plans and ideas. They loved French architecture, but I don't think there was really any question that it was going to be something along the lines of their English and Scottish ancestry. This is Ardrossan Place in Surrey, and it was designed by Ernest Newton for one of the Bentley boys, Wolfe Barnato, and this was in the January 1911 issue of Country Life, and the Montgomerys saw it, and so did Trumbauer, and they liked a lot of the elements of this house. And so they commissioned Trumbauer to draw up preliminary plans. Now, keep these dates in mind. January 1911, the preliminary plans were ready by the 1st of June 1911. Here are some of those plans, which were found at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. This is the north elevation of Ardrossan. And then there is the finished product. Ardrossan was 33,000 square feet. And they started construction in the fall of 1911. And the Montgomerys moved in, reinforced concrete and steel, by Christmas 1912. Garden facade of Ardrossan Place, of Ardrossan, some of the same elements as you can see. Facade in the Great South Lawn at Ardrossan when completed. Trumbauer designed the floor plan. This is the original floor plan for the first floor, also at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. And one archive sort of begets another. So you find something in your own archive or your own collection, and you're compelled to visit first one and then another. Second floor plan, the original second floor plan. Trumbauer did make 3 changes to this. He expanded a room here for Mrs. Montgomery's aunt, which also flipped the staircase here. And the guest room down here was moved here for Mrs. Montgomery's room. And Mrs. Montgomery's room became this space with the Colonel here. Now, the house was always a farm. It was always a dairy. The Colonel imported Ayrshire cows from Scotland with a friend of his named John Valentine. And Valentine took 18 purebred Ayrshires, and the Colonel 12. Valentine's cows all died, and the Colonel had 9 that survived. And he decided then and there that he was going to not lose his investment, but figure out what in the world had gone wrong. So he became sort of a pseudoscientist in the sense that he determined what was going on in the milking house with ventilation. Did the cows fare better outside during the winter or inside during the winter? It became actually the first dairy in the state of Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth to not have Bang's disease. The Colonel had a really interesting theory that if a cow wandered off, it couldn't come back. So house, you can see the magnitude of it. And there were lots of things written about the house when it was built, plain and simple as possible, but with the greatest care and thought. It was also known as a house of portraits. There were a lot of articles in the archive that I found calling it House of Portraits. This is the living room, and this is designed by White Alum and Company. The Colonel's portrait is at the far end, as you see. Interesting to you may be that by the door, they're now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection. Dining room with the Horace Binney portrait over the fireplace. Horace Binney being the mutual great-grandfather of both Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery. So the ancestral portraits in the house are all of their mutual ancestors. This is the library early on. Again, white alum design. And those low bookcases, if you've ever been to the Frick, same designer. The shelves built for the bronzes that were brought back as trip souvenirs. On, that's a Mattie Hewitt photograph. And the ballroom now. Now, it is a house of portraits, and this is Hope Brown Ives, her family endowed Brown University. This is by Healy. This is Francis Wallen, and this is by Gilbert Stewart. It's one of 2 Gilbert Stewarts in the house. And this is Elizabeth Caldwaller Hare, and this is by Thomas Sully. This portrait is the only portrait of someone not related to the Montgomerys in the house. And this is Paul Cobb Metham, and it was painted by Romney in 1776. The Montgomerys saw it at Knoedler Gallery in New York. And in 1912, they paid $7,800 for it. Originally, it hung over the fireplace in the dining room. It's now in a little corner in the library. And the reason that this is interesting is because the Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery were fascinated with American Revolution, with English and British, English history, Scottish history, but also this portrait was in Philadelphia at the time. This was purchased by Peter A.B. Widener in 1893 for Linwood Hall, and this is the companion piece to the Montgomery's portrait. This is Mrs. Paul Cobb Metham, and this is now in the National Gallery. This was actually painted by Gainsborough. Now, people ask me who my favorite artist is at Ardrossan, and I have to say it's Mrs. Montgomery. She was an extraordinary needlepointer, and she could sketch and paint and do all sorts of things. But needlepoint was really the thing that she was most noted for. She's needlepointing here in this photograph on a sofa that she needlepointed. There's the detail of it, 1937. She's got her initials in the corner, as you can see. Now, there are plenty of landscape pictures at Ardrossan. This is one by Charles Morris Young. But for her family and friends, Mrs. Montgomery did several needlepoints. And if you stand a little further back from it, you really can't tell that it's needlepoint. There's the painting, and there's the needlepoint. where all the Montgomery Scott Wheeler men were members, and this was prized by Mrs. Montgomery because, in fact, she did win a prize for it. Now, back to the archive and the snoop job that it takes to write a book. This is a Gainsborough painting called Landscape with Cattle, and I found it on a note in the archive and then on an inventory that was left there. But it wasn't at Ardrossan. It said in the inventory that it was in the library. It took 2 years to locate the picture, and this was another picture that had come to the Montgomerys through Knoedler in New York. They called it A View in Shropshire, but the Montgomerys bought it in 1916, sold it in 1966 to Paul Mellon, and it ended up in his Museum of Yale, the British Art at Yale, and is now on permanent exhibition. They now call it Landscape with Cattle. I found it very interesting too, in the library. Look at the mirror on the right-hand side. This is the view today. But this is Mrs. Montgomery's needlepoint of that room and the same view. And you can see in the right-hand corner in the mirror, the Gainsborough is reflected. Now, this is Helen Beach Tyler, Mrs. Montgomery, and her brother, George Tyler. Helen Beach Tyler was her father's sister. And when Mrs. Montgomery's mother died, she became the surrogate mother for the children. Many in the family, including Joni, has said many times that she was really the glue of the house and of the family. This is one of the early pictures of the children. This was taken here in Philadelphia. And in my research, I found this in the archive, which confirmed an earlier idea that this had been used for a painting. This painting was done by Franz Dvorak. He was a Czech painter. He didn't live in Philadelphia very long, but the children's grandfather, George Tyler, commissioned this, and he commissioned two, one for the boy and one for the girl. And also in the archive was this photograph of the Tyler drawing room at 15th and Walnut Street. Those windows look out over Walnut. It was actually a 15th Street address. And I don't know if you see what I see, but on the detail, there's one of the pictures here on the left in the drawing room. Now we're going to focus on the portraits of the 20th century. And all of this is information that was gleaned from going through those boxes while I had my brown bag lunch all those years ago. This is Irish painter John Levery and his wife Hazel. And this is actually a photograph of them arriving on the Majestic to visit Ardrossan to paint the portraits of the Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery in 1926. We were really very fortunate to find this. And true archivists out there, please hold your ears. We located it on eBay. So the Leverys moved into the main house, and they painted this portrait of the Colonel. The Leverys were an interesting couple. The Colonel took to Sir John Levery very quickly. Hazel was a bit of a difficult person. She didn't like coming to America, but it was where John Levery earned his income, painting portraits of society people. But she thought Americans were rude and crude and socially unacceptable to her, and she would write home sadly on Ardrossan stationery to her best friend, who was Winston Churchill's secretary, how loathsome it all was, except for where they were staying. She'd found some sort of contentment at Ardrossan. The interesting thing about Hazel Levery is that she was born in Chicago. And you might remember her image on the Irish banknote for some years. And there was a rumor, which I think has now been dispelled, that she'd had an affair with Michael Collins, the Irish revolutionary. So there was quite a time in 1926. They literally lived at Ardrossan for weeks turned into months. So they were there for quite a while. And the Colonel allowed Sir John to take commissions off of the property. So he painted other people in Radnor and Philadelphia. Here's the John Levery picture of Mrs. Montgomery. This is Montgomery's father, also John Levery. This hangs on the south wall of the library today. And Helen Beach Tyler hanging in a very prominent position over the fireplace in the ballroom. Now, the Montgomerys had 4 children, and a lot of the information that I gleaned from the archive came from letters, diaries, trip logs, and things that I don't think I was really, or any archivist, any research person were really meant to read because they were so intimate. So there was a lot of thought into what I would come to use in the book. And they had 4 children, Helen Hope Montgomery Scott, Mary Benny Montgomery Wheeler, Alex Montgomery, and then Charlotte Ives Montgomery. But I'm taking them a little out of order tonight because we're going to go down the path of how the portraits were painted. This is Mary Benny at a party at Fort Washington. And this is at the engagement party of William Rylander Stewart and Laura Biddle. And they are here. And this is Mary Benny. And I love it that she sort of kind of has her back to Fred Astaire, ignoring him. Fred Astaire's sister Adele is down here. This is Cordelia Drexel Biddle. You might know of her book, My Philadelphia Father, which was turned into a play and a Walt Disney movie called The Happiest Millionaire. This is the sculptor Joe Davidson down here in the beard. And so she really ran in quite an artistic group of people. She attended the Curtis. In case you're having difficulty picking her out, she's the stunningly beautiful one in the center here with the big cowl neck. And while she was there, she fell in love with Leopold Stokowski, and which took me also to the Curtis archive. The Curtis people are quite lovely. And you could match up the letters of knowing when the relationship began with the fact that her grades dipped. So that was also part of the research, comparing and putting a timeline together. Now, this photograph did not make the book, and I'm really still sad about it because it is indeed the most famous photograph ever taken of Mary Benny. Most of the people don't even know that that's Mary Benny Montgomery. This photograph was taken by Soshi Tsunami, and he photographed fabulous dancers back in that time period. Now, he was an interesting character in himself, to himself, and how he knew Mary Benny, we're still not quite sure. But he was the archival photographer for the Museum of Modern Art in New York for 40 years. And interestingly, in this day and age, you may appreciate this, his position at the Met kept him from going to an internment camp in World War II. Now, Mary Benny started a dance company, Mary Benny Dancers. It was really called a ballet in the paper, but there was also a lot of modern dance involved. She would design the costumes. This photograph was actually taken at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. That's Mary Benny, obviously, in the center. When the war came along, the male dancers went off to fight, and the company was dissolved. But I must tell you that when I interviewed Barbara Weisberger for the book, and I talked to her 2 or 3 times, she made it very, very clear to me that Mary Benny was the person that was responsible for the Pennsylvania Ballet getting off the ground because she knew all the people that could write the checks. Now, here she is at the Art Museum in 1938, and she was here to promote her performance with her company at the Robin Hood Dell. And so that's why I wanted you to see it tonight. After the dance company dissolved, she decided to do what she'd always wanted to do, and that was to be a mother. So she adopted first one baby and then another. And the newspapers in Philadelphia, I think this is really rather odd in today's world, but the newspaper said she retired to motherhood. But there she is at Ardrossan with her children, Mary and Joan. Then she met the love of her life, John Pierce Wheeler, and she married him, and he then adopted the girls, and they became Wheelers. Now, she was the first to have her portrait painted. She was a very unlikely, she just really did not want to have her portrait painted at all. The Montgomerys chose Ignacio Zulaga because they loved the idea of Goya and El Greco, and he was quite known for his romantic pictures, but he also painted very large religious pictures, and he hated doing portraits pretty much, but had to for the money. So he limited himself to only 3 portraits a year. Now, the Colonel had visited him twice and been told absolutely not. And so finally, Mary Benny was on the French Riviera with her aunt, the Colonel's sister Mary, and her husband Ned Halsey. And the Colonel sent her a telegram, and we sent the telegram. I should have kept a copy, but the telegram is either here in the museum or at the Historical Society. We're not sure where, but I have a copy of the text, and it says, to Mary Benny, Aunt Jenny writes that she has seen Zulaga and will be in Paris until June 15th. Cannot you arrange to go to Paris June 1st and sit for portrait? We would appreciate it very greatly. If done in Spain, it would take longer and more difficult. Sailing June 18th on the Aquitania. Now that's important. Remember Aquitania in a few minutes. To London. Communicate with Zulaga through Aunt Jenny or wire directly at once. Zulaga will make full-size portrait. Please do not fail us as he paints few. So, of course, in reading the telegram, I thought, who is Aunt Jenny? Who is Aunt Jenny? Well, that was a little more daunting than I thought it would be. But between the Ardrossan archive and the archive at the Historical Society, and thank you to Agnes Irwin. This is Aunt Jenny. She was Virginia Woodbury Lowry, and she married Jose Brunetti, who ended up being the 15th Duke of Argos. And so Aunt Jenny became a friend of the family when she lived in Philadelphia and was attending the Agnes Irwin School. They were friends until the end of their lives, and Aunt Jenny absolutely worshipped Mary Benny and was determined. So the Duke of Argos, Spanish, Zulaga, Spanish, although Aunt Jenny and her husband lived in Rome at the time, arrangements were made, and Zulaga painted Mary Benny. Now here she is in a photograph that we did have for the book, taken by Cecil Beaton at Ardrossan in the ballroom, and that's the finished portrait after the fact. Now, the next portrait. Here he is with Florence Hart, his first wife. This was at a little dinner for them when they were about to be married. When I said, remember the Aquitania, the Colonel was setting sail with Alex to go to London to have William Orpin paint his portrait. So William Orpin was known at the time for doing really splendid work, especially with male portraits. He was a British battlefield artist, and Roland Knoedler set up the whole transaction. Here is a black and white image of Orpin's portrait of Knoedler. And so the Colonel and Alex set sail, and one of the inspirations for that trip was this portrait done also by Orpin of Paul Mellon in 1924. So you can see what kind of image they were looking for Alex. And here it is. Now, Robert Montgomery Scott said to me, that's a great picture of a suit with my uncle's head on it. But if I'm going to interject anything personal tonight, it's that I really like this portrait. The fascinating thing is that it was one of Orpin's last. He actually died the following year. And he really hit it off with the Colonel and Alex. And the information in the archive that I read was that they stayed up late nights having lots to drink, which might account for this on the reverse of the painting. Yes, we actually took paintings down off the wall and looked on the backs, but this is on the back of Alex Montgomery's portrait. Barns, painted by William Orpin, he's underlined Orpin twice, with as much love as above, July 1930, barnyards to you. Get me, Steve, I mean, Alec. There's no money in it for you, but if you have any ideas what that means, we're open. It's still a mystery to this day what that means, but they became great friends. Now, to Hope Montgomery Scott. While the Colonel and Alec were in London having the portrait painted by William Orpin, Hope was off to Ireland to have Augustus John paint her portrait. Now, this is her wedding picture. She married Edgar Scott, who was heir to the Pennsylvania Railroad fortune, although the announcement of their wedding said, socialite debutante Helen Hope Montgomery marries Edgar Scott, playwright. And that might be because of his friendship with Philip Barry. Now, this was taken on the French Riviera. That's Philip Barry and his wife on the left and Hope and Edgar on the right. When I met Hope Scott, I asked her how her husband and Philip Barry met. She said they were roommates in college, and I thought nothing more of it. And then she died, and I started working on the book and discovered that Philip Barry had gone to Yale and Edgar had gone to Harvard. So then I learned that indeed, after Philip Barry graduated from Yale, he had gone to Harvard to study with George Pierce Baker. And George Pierce Baker was an English teacher at Harvard that became the father of the American playwright. Eugene O'Neill, all the playwrights in this country studied with George Pierce Baker at Harvard. He would later go to Yale, but to transfer his teaching to Yale, but then it was in Harvard. The Philadelphia Story and also a play called Holiday were inspired by the Montgomerys and Ardrossan, and they remain friends always. In fact, Robert Montgomery Scott was the godson of Philip Barry. This is Hope and Edgar with Ellen Barry at the revival of the Philadelphia Story at Lincoln Center, the most recent revival, which was probably 30 years ago. But this was, they stayed in touch, close touch for the rest of their lives. This didn't make the book, but the reason I'm putting this in here is because it's fascinating to me. This is Hope with Cary Grant, who played C.K. Dexter Haven in the Philadelphia Story. That's Edgar in the white jacket on the left. And that is Governor George Leader of Pennsylvania. And this was taken in Philadelphia at the premiere, the world premiere actually, of It Takes a Thief. And why would they have the world premiere of It Takes a Thief in Philadelphia? Well, it's because another Philadelphia girl was the star, Grace Kelly. Hope was someone who rode the hounds. Here she is in a photograph for Vogue. And so here's the portrait that is now in the museum collection. This portrait was the first of 3 painted by Augustus John. She wrote letters home, documenting her trip, so we know exactly what happened while she was in Galway, having this in Ireland, having John paint it. She made him laugh upon arrival because, again, he had to approve her before there was any question that he would go through with the sitting. But she tumbled out of the car upon arrival, and he was looking out the window and laughed. But still, they didn't get along very well at first. And she would write letters home saying that he didn't smell good, and he drank too much, and he didn't show up until 3 in the afternoon to paint me. And he was calling her temperamental. And then we got a letter. We listened to that. The archive had a letter saying that Edgar had snatched a Victrola and taken it to a room And they had danced all night and told dirty stories. And the next thing you know, she was writing home saying, he's the most marvelous man, and I'm having the most wonderful time. And the colonel said, well, good enough, because we've engaged him to do another portrait of you that we're going to give to Edgar. So the second portrait became one of John's masterpieces. Now, if you notice this, the face, the expression, much more appealing. And John had everything to say with what Hope was to wear in the sittings, and they became lifelong friends. Now, a side note about this portrait that's now in the museum collection is that a few years later it started to crack. And so the colonel wrote to John's agent and said, the paint's coming off. And it was determined, they thought it was the heating system at Ardrossan. And the colonel says, well, it can't be my heating system. I have the best that money can buy. And I have a house full of portraits and no other portraits cracking. So then John said, well, I think it might have been the brushes that I used or the way I applied the paint. And finally, he decided it was the inferior canvases, his last letter about it. Well, Knoedler comes in again. He takes the portrait to New York, repairs it, and brings it back, and all's well for the rest of the time that it was at Ardrossan. This portrait appeared in several magazines, and several art critics said it was truly Augustus John's best. Now, here she is with Cecil Beaton again. You remember the Mary Benny picture that Cecil Beaton took. He visited at the same time and took this one of Hope with her portrait, again for Vogue. Now, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the third portrait, although it's 1938. This is John and Anne Ingersoll with the Scots on the Ile-de-France. Apparently, they didn't even know they were all sailing together. They were thrilled. Every bit of this trip was documented. Hope sent letters home with even what they ate. It was really a grand time, and she was going to London specifically to sit for John for the third time. And if you're a trivia nut and you want to know about the Ile-de-France, what other Philadelphia connection it has, that it was the crew of the Ile-de-France that plucked Richard Dilworth and his wife out of the water after the Andrea Doria sank in 1956. You can use that if you're on Jeopardy. This is taken on board the ship. That's Edgar far right, talking to Daisy Lucas. That's Anne Ingersoll in the middle. The gentleman is Paul Lucas. And Paul Lucas would go on to win the Oscar for Best Actor for Watch on the Rhine. And the woman on the left is Kitty Miller. And Kitty Miller was a fascinating person, a philanthropist. Her father had purchased Goya's Red Boy, and you've probably seen that at the Met. But we're going to freeze frame here and tell you what happens next. The Scots arrive in London. They take a sweet hotel room. They start on the portrait. Augustus John is raring to go, and then his father dies. So he disappears to Wales for 2 weeks, and then wires that he's going to be longer because he's been appointed the executive of the estate and he can't come back right away. Well, Edgar thinks, I can't stay in London all this time. I have business in Philadelphia. I have to go back home. What are we to do? Well, Hope can't stay in a hotel alone. It's just not done. So she moves in with Sir Gifford Fox and his wife, Miranda. Now, the Fox he's in the Parliament, a minister in the Parliament, and they're very, very socially connected. So, of course, Hope's having a grand time, weekends in the country and all that. And then John returns and work begins again on the portrait, but it's not very quick. And the Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery are back at Ardrossan wringing their hands because all they're talking about at that period of time in 1938 is Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. And Hope is rather oblivious to it, according to the correspondence. But the Montgomerys are very keen because they have even made arrangements for the German ambassador to America, who has resigned, to take refuge at Ardrossan. He chooses to go back to Germany and actually has to live under house arrest. But they are more aware of what's going on in London than Hope seems to be. So the correspondence gets rather terse, and finally they send, "Don't worry about portrait, you did your best, dearest love." Well, that didn't seem to work. So within 24 hours or so, "Sail Normandy without fail. We need you more than portrait. Do not bother if it's not finished. We are sure it will come later, dearest love, Mom and Dad." And so she did sail the Normandy, and she did return home, and the portrait was sent back to Ardrossan for safekeeping because they thought that it could easily be destroyed in London during the war. John signed it in the upper right-hand corner provisionally. It was always meant to be finished. It never was. When I knew Hope Scott, I recall this being in her dining room, if I'm correct, at Orchard Lodge. But she didn't return to London for 10 years. She didn't go back until 1948. And so by that time, there was just, you know, it was fine. They kept it as is. Now, this I put in for your own amusement, and I guess mine. This is a telegram that the Colonel sent in December of 1930, after those first 4 portraits were done, the 2 of Hope and 1 of Mary Benny and of Alex. And he's writing it to Harry Blake Tyler, who was Mrs. Montgomery's cousin, Helen Beach Tyler's nephew, in London. And he writes that he can't take the stallion because Orpin, Zulaga, and John have absorbed available surplus. So that year, his extra cash went to the portraits. Now, the last portrait that was done was Charlotte Ives. Now, Charlotte Ives was the baby. She was the youngest child. And she was really quite an extraordinary woman. This was taken at her debut, a tea at Ardrossan. She was a renowned horsewoman. This was taken at Coral Gables, Florida. And she was really, really quite an extraordinary athlete. She was one of the first women in the area that learned to fly. And the last portrait was painted by Philippe de Laszlo. Now, we don't know anything about this from our own archive. We know about it from de Laszlo's archive in his diary. He wrote about it extensively, saying that the portrait did not go well because the subject was so precocious, and she didn't want to get down off of her horse to sit for the portrait. It was painted on this in the solarium at Ardrossan, and de Laszlo started taking commissions, unbeknownst to the Colonel, outside the property, and the Colonel didn't have the same relationship he did with Sir John Levery. Didn't like it at all. Mrs. Montgomery sat in for the torso, and Mary Benny for the hands. And finally, within, say, 24 or 48-hour period of time, de Laszlo took a brush and a palette knife and finished the face and got the face down. And it's now part of the de Laszlo. It's still in the ballroom at Ardrossan, but the Philippe de Laszlo people came from London and said, "Oh, we found the missing de Laszlo." And I pointed out that we didn't really think it was missing. But it's now in their catalog raisonné, and you can see it online. Now, the Colonel died in 1949, Mrs. Montgomery in 1970, and life went on at the dairy. Hope managed the dairy. This is Hope at the National Horse Show at the old Madison Square Garden. She was the first woman to judge at the horse show. Mary Benny reinvented herself as a photographer. She went to India and Sri Lanka many, many, many times, and she lectured. And today you can go online and see the Mary Benny Wheeler collection at the University of Pennsylvania. Hear her narration if you would like. And Alec Montgomery stayed very involved in local politics. Unfortunately, even having Gerald Ford at Ardrossan didn't help Kurt Weldon, but they tried. And then Charlotte Ives spent most of her life in Georgetown, South Carolina, but in her older years, she moved back to Ardrossan and could live in any of the rooms she wanted to, but she chose her girlhood bedroom on the 3rd floor. And this is Ardrossan today, and it's open from time to time. We hope you'll visit. There's a lovely tour sponsored through Chanticleer. If you go online, they're taking, I don't know if they're taking reservations for the spring yet, but they probably will. Or if you have the main line school night catalog, they offer tours. The fall is, I think, sold out, but the spring is coming. And we hope that you'll visit. It's quite a magical place, and I hope that I've imparted a bit of that to you this evening. And I thank you very much. It's been lovely to be here with you. Thank you. So now I think questions we're doing.
Yeah, we're happy to get questions from the audience, and we do have mics that we're passing around. So if you just raise your hand, we'll get one to you.
You become involved with the family, and what were the circumstances that you get to live at the house?
Oh, boy. Well, the question is how I became involved with the family and the circumstances of how I became to live at the house. My friends that are here know this story so many times, but everything in Philadelphia for me starts and ends with a man named Frank McGlynn. Frank C.P., Crescent Potts McGlynn. He was a banker and a lawyer, and he lived in Haverford. And he was, when I moved to Philadelphia, a father figure to me. And so I would come out from Center City to see him on the weekends. And one time he said, "You really should meet Hope Scott. She's a character. You have the same sort of sense of humor. I think you'd love one another." We had mutual friends in Josh and Netta Logan. The Scotts knew the Logans, and so did my family. So it was kind of an easy introduction. And she invited me out to her house, and we did indeed hit it off. The second part of the question about how I came to live in the house was to be unoccupied for the first time. The family was not, no member of the family was to live there. And my husband and I were living in upstate New York, and we got a call saying, would we be interested, because we knew the house and we love the house. And, I know about the mechanicals of it. So, I mean, I'm not very good with a wrench, but my point is that I knew where the cable box was, for instance. And so we entertained the idea and decided not to do it because it was too much responsibility. And then we sort of put a line down the middle of a legal pad with the pros and cons about coming back to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia just always wins. It just always wins for us. So we're there in the house now until some determination can be made about its future.
Or 1911, and were most of the furnishings in that house brought to Ardrossan?
The question is, where did the Colonel live before 1911, and were most of the furnishings brought to Ardrossan? The Colonel grew up in Radnor Township, and also the family, the Montgomery family, had a farm in Chester County. They also had inherited, the Colonel inherited with his two siblings, an estate in New Jersey. 2 or 3 really wonderful pieces of furniture are at Ardrossan from the New Jersey estate. The Colonel collected most of the furniture in the house. His early, life was always being in the banking industry in Center City. So he commuted in. His father commuted in from Radnor. And then White and Allum made a lot of the furniture for the house specifically, based on the dimensions of the rooms. Then some of the furniture came from the Tyler House at 15th and Walnut Street. And Auntie, who was Helen Beach Tyler that I mentioned, was quite a genealogist and a historian. And she read everything, and she had a fabulous book collection. And she also was a collector of antiques, and has several pieces of the furniture there from the Tyler family from before even George Tyler's time. So it's a collection of things. But the Montgomerys are very interesting about, they bought four really extraordinary pretzel back chairs, but and they had been displayed actually at the Pennsylvania Museum of Art, these four chairs. They're in the ballroom today. But the Montgomerys wanted 6. So they either bought 2 knockoffs or had 2 chairs made to match, and they used all 6 equally. They didn't discriminate. So Ardrossan was sort of an interesting house for its time. I mean, Mrs. Montgomery had lunch with her children. You had to step over the German Shepherd dogs to get into the living room. It was really a lived-in house, and so with the furniture, they used all of it to, just the way there was. Even the treasured pieces were put into use. The question was how many acres are with the original house. It started with 300, ended with 750. Those have all been sold off with the exception of 10. And there is a conservation easement around the property of about 100 acres. Is that correct? I'm told, give or take. So, but 10 proper with the house.
It's done. Were they pleased with the results?
Well, the question is, were they pleased with the results? There's really not a lot of documentation about that, except to say that how could they not be? And I'll tell you, this is kind of an inside story. Hope Scott was adamant that nothing be taken from the house, that her siblings leave everything in the house when that nothing was to be sold or given away. However, when she died, she left her portrait to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it stayed at Ardrossan by special arrangement until Robert Montgomery Scott died. That's when the art museum came calling. And I just think, why would she leave it to an art museum where it could be on full display if she wasn't pleased? And that was even the first portrait with the scowl on her face, right? So I think they're really quite exquisite portraits.
Invite everyone out to the lobby. We do have books available for purchase, and David has graciously agreed to sign them. Also, if you parked in the museum garage and you want parking validation, you could see me or my colleague Julia for that. So please make sure to do that. So David, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you.